Blackface, white supremacism. But before we begin, please note this public service announcement. My topic is not global warming, but I feel I must mention it. It's the biggest issue facing humans today, maybe ever, and it's worse than you realize. If you are under 30, you likely have hard times ahead. These greedy bastards don't give a shit about your future. This generation just isn't too concerned. So it's up to you. Better get yourself educated. Now, back to our regularly scheduled program. Imagine for the moment that you have pale skin and you need a Halloween costume. Maybe something funny or scary. Your friend has a different idea. He says, you should go black. So you smear on some dark makeup and put on a fake afro. What's wrong with this picture? A white person putting on blackface or a fake afro is an act of racism. This is racist. This is not racist. They are different because of the historical context. So let's consider that context. Sometime around 1830, whites invented blackface minstrel shows. A minstrel show is like a musical variety show. White people blacken their faces and perform songs, dances, and comical skits. The most famous performer called his blackface character Jim Crow. He dressed in shabby clothes and pretended he was a slave. He jumped around in an exaggerated, awkward song and dance. Remember that name, Jim Crow. Frederick Douglass referred to blackface performers as, quote, the filthy scum of white society who have stolen from us our complexion to make money and pander to the contempt of their fellow white citizens. Focus on that last phrase. They pander to the contempt of their fellow white citizens. Blackface shows were a display of white contempt for people with dark skin. The shows portrayed blacks as negative stereotypes, stupid, lazy, aimless, superstitious, and cowardly. In other words, lacking positive qualities, not fully human. These were the same stereotypes used by slave owners like Thomas Jefferson to justify slavery. According to the slave owners, subhumans must do the awful jobs. So who would attend these racist, mocking, dehumanizing, contemptuous performances? The white working class, including Irish immigrants. They loved minstrel shows because it made them feel like they weren't at the very bottom of society. It was a way of saying, hey, we're white too. Irish were poor and foreign-born and discriminated against, but at least they were superior to blacks. Irish Americans also started race riots during the Civil War. Once you dehumanize others in your mind, the next step is brutalizing their bodies. I'll repeat that. Once you dehumanize others in your mind, the next step is brutalizing their bodies. After almost 250 years of chattel slavery, Congress outlawed it in 1865, freeing 4 million people. So there was no more need for blackface minstrel shows, right? Wrong. In the late 19th century, blackface minstrels became even more popular. The end of slavery meant that blacks and whites might be social equals. So working class whites needed blackface to boost their fragile egos. Same with racist segregation. White-only schools, businesses, neighborhoods, and public transportation were a way to keep blacks feeling inferior and whites feeling superior. That's white supremacism. The entire racist system was named Jim Crow segregation. So, a quick review. Blackface minstrel shows were a display of white contempt for black people. The most famous character was Jim Crow, which became the nickname for racist segregation. And all of this is white supremacism, which means the need of white folks to assert superiority over others in order to cover up their own insecurities. So it's not just a wig and makeup, it's all of this. In the early 20th century, the new motion picture industry continued the tradition. This silent film, Birth of a Nation, portrayed blacks as sexual predators. It also sparked a real-life revival of the Ku Klux Klan. For Jewish actors who also faced discrimination, blackface was a way to assert their own whiteness by being white supremacists. Most of the early Hollywood stars performed in blackface at some point. It was standard procedure. Even Dorothy had to do it. Blackface may have even influenced the design of this critter. My point is that blackface was very common before 1960 because whites thought it was fun and funny to mock blacks. It made them feel good to make blacks look bad. After 1960, after the civil rights movement turned many whites against Jim Crow segregation, blackfacing entered a new phase. Hollywood filmmakers used it less often, but it remained a common practice in places where whites gathered. Suburbs and country clubs, college campuses and frat houses, talent shows and sporting events. Blackfacing often included KKK costumes. in case the racism wasn't already clear enough, pandering to the contempt of their fellow white citizens. And it still goes on today, as you know. You will notice that blackfacers typically pretend they are gangsters or gangster rappers, updating the minstrel show stereotypes. They typically use derogatory language when in blackface. Blackfacing has become a form of white male bonding, not unlike and not unrelated to trophy hunting. Expressing dominance and rejecting empathy. Expressing dominance and rejecting empathy. That's white male privilege. And when they get tired of blackface, they find some other group to denigrate. But here's who blackfacers don't imitate. Black doctors, judges, scientists, scholars. People who might have something to teach them. One thing about being white in the USA, it's easy not to care about the historical context of racism. That's part of white privilege too. Whites don't need to consider that the racist historical context has set them up to succeed. They don't need to know how the racist historical context has set blacks up to fail. That's not a problem for whites. They can just enjoy their privilege, content in their entitlement and ignorance. Let other people suffer the burden of history. I'll say it again. Once you dehumanize others in your mind, the next step is brutalizing their bodies. Now you can understand how these two examples of face paint are different. One is a celebration of white supremacism. That's cowardly. That's dehumanizing. The other is challenging white supremacism. The two men on the right were participating in a march demanding that blacks be allowed to vote in Alabama. That was courageous. That was rehumanizing. So you get the picture. They stick it on their face to stick it in your face. Blackface is the privilege of white people to mock black people for bearing the burden of history. I'll repeat that. Blackface is the privilege of white people to mock black people for bearing the burden of history. Blackface means making that burden worse rather than together, black and white and everybody else, pushing back against the racist legacy of our history.